Hi, I'm Jason Inman.
And I'm Ashley Victoria Robinson.
And we're here to give you a spoiler-free review of Pixar's The Incredibles 2. Now, this has been a movie 14 years in the making. This is the one Pixar movie that everybody had wanted a sequel to for so long. We're finally here. We finally got to see it. We got to see it early thanks to Disney. There will be no spoilers in this review, but to be honest with you, there isn't much to spoil in this movie because it's a pretty straightforward superhero movie. The first thing that we got to say out of the gate is I think it's just as fun as the original.
I do too. Go see it in the theaters. I will say I don't think it captures the same magic and zeitgeist as the first one, but that's what happens with a sequel. This is something that we're familiar with. We're not being
nothing to be
introduced
surprised
to
with.
it. But it is super fun. It's a great ride.
I did a great tweet, and I think really, and I'm not complimenting myself on my tweets. I'm sorry.
You did a great tweet.
Thank you. I can tweet really well sometimes. But I think it really encapsulates it because this really does come off as a great second issue to like your favorite comic book you've never read before. And if I were to give this movie any major problems, I think the biggest problem with this movie is the fact that it really demands an Incredibles 3, like immediately. I want to see what the third issue is.
Yeah.
Now, the interesting thing about this movie that I really liked, and I think it's a very smart move, is that a lot of the focus of this movie is on Elastigirl. Holly Hunter is basically the main character of this movie, not even the family. It is Elastigirl.
Absolutely, yeah. Which I appreciate because Bob is really the focal point of the first movie. And since, like you said, it doesn't demand a sequel in the way that Pirates of the Caribbean 2 demanded a sequel.
Oh, no.
But
there's no cliffhanger ending.
But it is very heavy hand. It sort of tips the hand that might be where production or executives want it to go. And to me, I think that would answer kind of what you're talking about. So the first movie would be Bob's movie. The second movie would be Helen's movie.
The
and
third
the third movie would be the kids.
Yeah.
Because my main criticism of this would be that Dash gets no character development in this movie. And all the other family members do. Even Frozone gets a huge step up in this movie.
Frozone, it's very interesting. So you can tell, they looked at the first movie, and they could tell that Frozone was a very popular character with the audience. He gets a lot more screen time in this movie.
He's so great.
And also, we talked about this briefly after the movie. I think they upped his power ability. He seems much more powerful in this movie than he did in movie 1.
Episode 1.
Yes.
And so does Violet.
Yes.
Violet, Frozone, and Jack, but with Jack, it's more plot-driven, really get more interesting uses of their powers. Violet, this is not a huge spoiler because it's in the trailers if you're looking for it. Violet can actually use her force fields in a more projectile way, in a more creative
like Sue
way.
Storm.
Which is so cool to see, and it makes her more active, and I actually think it makes her a much more I love Violet, but it makes her even more likable in this movie.
That is one of the strengths of Incredibles 2. Incredibles 2, I think, and I'm going to credit a lot of this to Brad Bird, because one of the things I enjoyed about this movie so much, and I think a lot of comic book writers could take, again, a lot of pages from this movie, there are some amazing sequences and original inventive ways for how these supers use their powers.
Yes.
There is a sequence with Elastigirl and a train that I am not going to spoil, but some of the stuff she does in this sequence literally had the audience with us. We were going like, whoa, wow, holy cow. Another, speaking of powers, let's talk about this. Let's talk about the character that steals the movie, that I did not expect to steal the movie, Jack.
Yeah.
Jack is the funniest character in this movie. They add an interesting element to his story that we're not going to spoil that really kind of pushes his character forward a lot, but also at the same time, that's almost Bob's main story too.
It is.
At first, you really get the impression that Bob's story is going to be, oh, I'm the stay-at-home dad. But that's not what his story is at all. His story is really, how do I deal with my kids? And that storyline is primarily focused on everything that Jack gets up to in this movie. And there is an amazing scene where Jack fights an animal. I'm not going to tell you what kind of animal it is, but it's one of the best sequences and the funniest sequences of the movie.
I give it less than a year before we're getting stuffed animal versions of that critter.
Okay.
Because there aren't any out there now, so you can't Google any spoilers for that, but It'll come. It
Okay.
definitely will. You've seen in the trailers, you've seen some of the scenes with Jack and how Bob has to deal with them. And I think it's...
There's more. There's way more.
so much more.
Yeah.
And it affects all these other characters in really interesting ways. Without spoiling anything, Edna actually gets involved in Jack's story in a really sweet and interesting way.
Let's talk about Edna here. Do you think that originally when I heard that Edna Mode was coming back to this movie, I was like, oh, they're just doing it because they're doing the checklist of everything they did in the first movie. I think that she serves a very interesting utility in this movie that's different than just making costumes to The Incredibles. And actually was, at first when she showed up in the movie, I was like, oh, they're just going to repeat everything. This is not going to work. This joke is not going to work a second time. But it works because they do it differently.
Yeah, I love Edna.
Yeah.
I think she's fabulous. I love that Brad Bird does her voice. I think that's hilarious.
We get the reveal of her logo in this movie, which is
great.
Which is really good.
And that's not on a t-shirt yet, and I'm
upset
about it. I want one.
one.
Yes, because I think if there are Incredibles movies going forward, I think we should have an Edna scene. I think this movie proved that.
She's their cue.
Well, but she's basically an exposition dump. You know, she's a plot device, but using her in a different way with a different spin, even though you're seeing a lot of the same tropes, and that's what Incredibles movies are. They're tropes. They're tropes done to the best degree, which is why we like them as tropes. And that's why I think, because Edna wasn't overused, and because we saw her through a slightly different lens, she's really enjoyable in the movie.
Okay, so let's talk about the villain of this movie, the Screen Splicer. That is the character.
Screen Slaver.
Screen Slaver, excuse me. That is the character that you've seen in some of the trailers with the goggles and the black mask. Very S&M kind of freaky character. Great design. They are the main villain of this movie. Their plot line is basically about, of course, they don't want the supers to come back. And this character is basically based around, it's the big twist of the third act, is what is this villain doing? Who is this villain? And basically, why are they doing it? Now, I think that this villain, one of the things that doesn't work for this villain for me is that this villain has no personal connection to the Incredibles family, which is something that, even though Syndrome from the first movie is kind of silly, kind of goofy, but him being the biggest fan of Mr. Incredible, seeing him in a flashback really actually made his story more important, and we don't get that with Screen Splicer. Screen Slaver? God, what a dumb name. Sorry.
Yeah, I agree. I think Screen Slaver, I think there's good ideas there, but I think, like you brought up, a more personal connection to Mr. Incredible, Elastigirl, and the family would have made it stronger, because there's a good foundation, but the house built on top of it maybe isn't as strong as it could be. I think it's interesting that in the second Incredibles movie, you could view Syndrome as a representation of toxic fandom, and I think it's interesting that now we have a version of like a keyboard warrior.
Oh yeah, almost
or an anonymous type figure.
This villain is almost a representation or even a metaphor, really kind of almost for social media, really.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting that the Incredibles are doing that, and that, to me, these two villains mirror each other, but in different approaches.
Yes.
So I think they're an okay villain, not as great as we saw in the first movie.
Let's talk about what I think is the greatest cameo in this movie. This is not a spoiler. I don't know, it might be a spoiler. Let's just say there is a gadget from the first Incredibles movie that plays a very important part in Incredibles 2. I had forgotten about this gadget. You see it in the first 15 minutes of Incredibles 1. When you see it in this movie, I was actually overjoyed to see it again, and it has a connection to the third act of the movie, and even Frozone. And the moment, I loved it. I did not see that coming, and I should have seen this coming a mile away. Did not see it coming. I was clapping every moment of it. The score, we gotta talk about the big underappreciated part of this movie that helps this movie soar is the score by Michael Giacchino.
We could not say enough nice things about him.
God damn, they need to let Michael Giacchino score a James Bond movie because it's awesome. And rest assured, when the end credits of Incredibles 2 hits, you get the end credits again. You get the same awesome music from Incredibles 1, and they do the credits in the same style. That
kind of like vector pop art
so
thing.
Don't go anywhere. Just sit down and watch those amazing credits. Watch all the amazing people floating by. It's really cool. Ashley, let me talk about this. Let's talk about final thoughts here. Is there a character that stands or storyline that stands out to you in this movie that you really enjoyed in this movie?
To me, it's definitely, I loved Elastigirl in the first Incredibles. I really like seeing her evolve in this movie.
Yeah.
She had the biggest change come for her, and I like seeing her kind of become her own woman. We saw her bring the family together, and now we're seeing her put herself back together. That's what stands out to me. I love the Edna scene, like I mentioned at the top. So those are the two things that stood out the most to me. How about you?
I would say Elastigirl. Yeah. This is Elastigirl's movie, but Bob gets a very interesting storyline as well, where he learns that he can be a hero
in a softer way.
Yeah, without using his fists.
Yeah.
Like, a lot of the movie is him being like, hey, you don't have to punch everything. You don't have to punch everything. And it's very funny where he's like, just because I'm forceful about... He has a line where he says, like, just because I'm forceful about stuff doesn't mean I'm not a good hero.
Yeah.
Which is very interesting. I would say overall, this is just, I think, a really solid movie. This is a really solid comic book. This is exactly what this movie needed to be. I do agree with you, it's not as good as the first one, but it's only like, I think, a 0.25 less than the first movie. And again, it is that we're not surprised by this movie, where we were blown away by the first movie. But man, I'll tell you what, I'm definitely going to go see this in IMAX. I am definitely going to see this again.
Absolutely. I'm definitely going to buy it.
I'm going to buy it.
Yeah. It is like the first movie. It is candy for all of your senses.
Yes. And the animation, it's funny, we watched Incredibles 1 right before we saw, the night before we saw Incredibles 2. And the step up in animation is apparent in the very first frame. You're like, holy cow, Mr. Incredible has never looked this good.
Just look at Elastigirl's hair.
Yep.
Like, the animation, I mean, Pixar always levels up their animation from movie to movie, but now that we've had almost a decade and a half between the two, it's awesome to see how far they've come.
Let's go with final thoughts and then give this a score out of 1 to 5.
1 to 5.
5 being the best.
Final thoughts, if you liked Incredibles 1, you will like Incredibles 2. It is a worthy sequel. It definitely sets up more, and I'm hoping that we get a trilogy out of these characters. I loved getting a chance to revisit them. I'll give it a 4. If I would give Incredibles 1 a 5. I think it's a pretty close to a perfect movie. I'll give Incredibles 2 a 4.5 for being just being a little less surprising. How about you?
I am going to give Incredibles 2. It is a fun ride. It is definitely one of the better movies I've seen this summer. It's easily one of the most enjoyable movies I've had this entire summer because I was clapping, I was laughing, I was never bored by anything. And again, with the exception of maybe Avengers Infinity War, this is the first movie of the summer, the second movie of the summer where I like walked out and I could have gone right to another screening. We could have walked right into another screening of this and I'd have been fine.
Absolutely.
And actually, I'm very excited. I actually am a little mad now that I have to wait a week to watch it again because I would be like, let's go see it tonight. Let's go see it tonight.
It's a nice problem to have.
It is a nice problem to have. If I were to rank this movie, I would give it a 4.75. out of 5. And I agree with you.
You're just getting ridiculous.
I am getting ridiculous. I'm getting incredible. Incredible. I don't know how to say French. So, it's such a hair step down from Incredibles 1, but it's so damn enjoyable. It's so good. And I really want Incredibles 3 now. I didn't know if I ever wanted Incredibles 2 because I was like, oh, it's the nice dream of it. But they gave it to us. And now that they gave us Incredibles 2, I think we need the trilogy. And if they do the trilogy, I definitely want to see Mr. Incredible's Joker, Bon Voyage. Remember him from the first one? Yes. I think he is Mr. Incredible's Joker. I want him to be the main villain. He's out there somewhere. You have Bon Voyage. You deal with the villain's kids against the hero's kids, right? And his kids can be called the Bomblings.
Someone please send us a custom Bon Voyage action figure.
Oh my God, please make me a custom Bon. We have a P.O. box. Oh my God. You can find it on some of these videos. That'd be amazing. Incredibles 2 is a great ride. I think it's going to be... It's interesting. This is definitely the summer of superheroes. With the Incredibles and Avengers, it's definitely the summer of superheroes. And
in our golden age.
Incredibles 2, go see it opening weekend so that we can get Incredibles 3 because it is a blast of a time. It's very funny, and it's a great movie. So get down in the comments and tell us what you're the most excited to see in The Incredibles 2. Also, while you're down there, click subscribe.
And for more exclusive geeky content, check out patreon.com/Jawiin. Suit up and be a super friend in the Hall of Justice.
Thanks for watching, Super Friends.